Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest BIA webinar. And this is revisiting a topic we haven't discussed for a little while, that's going to be a very pressing one for the rest of this year. We're back to Brexit. So we're in lockdown mode, rather like the Archers, recording individually from our own homes. And we're very lucky to be joined today by Emma Dufour, who chairs the BIA's Regulatory Affairs Advisory Committee, and she'll be able to take us through the detail of the Northern Ireland Protocol and other matters. But first of all, we'll hear from Steve Bates, our CEO, about what's been going on while we've all been thinking about other things. So, Steve.
Thanks, Nikki. Morning, everyone. And today's plan is to look at where we are now, what we're doing in terms of planning for January 2020. Then we'll dive into some of the detail around the Northern Ireland Protocol, which will become both it's both an issue that members have come to us with, but is also important in terms of our overall thinking about regulation. And then Emma will go through the thinking from RAC there, and we'll have some time for some discussions and questions. But I thought it might be useful just to sort of take people back since we were last together, which scarily now is about 4 months ago. So perhaps next slide, please.
In fact, the next slide is the first of the pop polls. We're going to ask you how ready you feel for the end of the transition period. So you've got choices there from very ready to not ready at all. And if you'd like to start voting now, we'll give you a minute to make your views known on that.
So 169 days, we think, Nikki, to the end of this. I'm sure everybody will be prepped for Christmas. So if you're prepped for Christmas and prepped for the end of transition, then I imagine you get a super even more ready than very ready. But it sort of helps me think about my plan for Christmas shopping this time frame as well.
Okay, well, that's always a useful, and thank you very much for the first mention of Christmas in one of these things. It's not striking fear into our hearts at all. Okay, we'll give it another few seconds. We've got nearly 3/4 of people have voted so far, and it's looking like hardly anyone is very ready. So if we close the poll in 4 seconds, there we go. So 52% somewhat ready, 37% not very ready. And cheeringly, nobody, 3% are not ready at all, but 8% are very ready.
Thank you, really useful. And we've got a few of these coming on, not only to keep you awake and to get your fastest finger first, but also I hope that we'll give you a sense of where the BIA community is, and that's great to see. So thank you for that. So yeah, what's been going on, I suppose, is the thought process, and thanks to Peter, who's done me a fantastic timeline since we were last together of some of the elements that I think are important. So this is a bit of a catch up, but also I hope you can see some things. So we were last together early March. The talks have kept going all the way really through the lockdown era, but it feels like history a while ago, isn't it? Things like a new leader of the Labour Party in April, the talks continuing on Zoom from the middle of April. I think one of the important ones here that we may want to come back to is the publication on the 19th of May of the UK's negotiating position. So we saw the legal text of what the UK is endeavouring to do, and the UK's approach to the Northern Ireland Protocol in the 20th of May, which is really some of the stuff that we'll come on to and talk about later, which I think we've been ruminating on, thinking about within there. And of course, we've then, since then, going on to the next slide, we've seen that as we've gone through June, the deadline to seek an extension to the transition period passed at the end of June, but ahead of that, there was a letter from us about the need for a mutual recognition agreement between the EU and the UK in medicines, We've had transition as the border delivery group, which is the group that's looking at the issues to do with the technical issues around border, has moved from the Treasury side of things, Revenue and Customs, into the Cabinet Office to be closer to Michael Gove in the centre of government. So you've got lots of this going on across the period, but I suppose the key thing is that we got to a moment of certainty. The deadline to extend the transition period has now passed, and we are now operating in a period where we know for certain that the end of transition will happen at the end of the year. So perhaps that's a good place to sort of then think about the developments as to where we are today. If we can move to the next slides there, and obviously border planning has been developed. Sorry, go back one. Apologies. And there's sort of two elements to back another one, please. What should we?
Whoops.
We're going forwards at a vast old rate rather than backwards.
I know, this is a mystery to me. Let me grapple with that.
There we go. Yeah, so as we are in July, we've got the announcement that there's going to be £750 million investment in building port and inland infrastructure, memorably the lorry park somewhere in East Kent, so that border movements can take place away from the Channel ports, and new border posts will be created inland so that people know lorries don't go to ports when there's no space for them. So that's sort of in plan and is happening now. The next thing that's happened, of course, in terms of the get ready for the end of the year. Next slide, please. Is the gradation of this through next year, so that there's going to be a phased implementation of controls. Full controls from January on things like alcohol and tobacco, but time for others to get ready through April and into July for other types of things. And I think this is endeavouring to realise that this is a big change and it needs to be feathered in. So I'm not going to go through the detail of it, but there is some easements of this into the timings of this for some of the checks going forward. And then the other thing that we're sort of at now, next slide, is the immigration system, so the way to get people into the country, and the points-based system has been published and sets out the nature of the points-based system, requirement for visas, how you get to 50 points, minimum salary requirement of 20,480, and a more relevant salary threshold of 25,000 for things that are likely to be relevant for our sector. Those with job offers in shortage occupations such as in nursing and civil engineering will also be able to earn extra points. And we've been looking at this in some detail. At the moment, there was also an announcement this week around the health and care visa. We're interested to see that under SOC code 2112, biological scientists and biochemists were listed as those who can professions that can qualify for a health and care visa. So that may be of relevance to members. Next slide, please. What are we doing in terms of planning for January 2020? Well, the big joke, the big reveal, and the cute animal pictures at the midpoint of our webinar. We've gone back to those thanks to popular demand. And what can you do between now and Christmas? Well, probably grow an onion. That'll be ready. Or if you have goats, you might be able to get to a baby goat or a rhesus monkey. Or those of us who are students of history and follow politics regularly will know that Viscount Goderich, is that got his name right, Vicky? And he lasted 144 days, the second shortest premiership in British political history. Was been and come and gone. So we're expecting to see more stability this year in politics than we have in previous years. But we can see what you can do in the time we've got till Christmas. Obviously, the new thing that's happening at the moment, and you may have seen this on social media feeds, is the new government's Let's Get Going public outreach campaign. The UK's New Start, focused on transition, asking people to check, change, and then go. And this is likely to be the process that will run for the end of transition period. Nice picture of fishing there, and I suppose my question and the way I've been thinking about this is, if you think about what those of us in the BIA have been doing what's going to stay the same since what we've been doing for no deal planning last year, what isn't the same, and what is there that's changed or we don't know about. So some things I think we can see that in terms of planning for the end of transition, we are likely to be along similar stages as to they were before. We spent much time last year, if you were with us last year, looking at freight routes and how do you get government procured space on various routes for medicines and essential medical supplies. Those contracts were established last year. The government have got them in place. I think we're likely to see a similar process with ticketing and all the rest of it rolling out. The Cabinet Office and the Department of Health know what they're doing, and although we're not there yet, I think that there is likely to be something similar to that which we've seen before, an emergency aeroplane route, ability for there to be government procured space, and some ability to help with routing away from the short straits for companies if they so desire. And I think we'll see that coming because that's essentially in the government plan and will happen again. Much of the work that was delivered through the MHRA in terms of the planning for statutory instruments, the legal basis on which no deal as it was framed last year or end of transition as it would be now remains in place. It's the same stuff. There's no new things that need to go through Parliament. So much of that where work was done last year remains the same and is relevant. Much of it's on our Brexit microsite, MHRA sites and all the rest of it. And again, I think that the MHRA's guidance developed ahead of the deadline last year remains relevant for end of transition at the end of 21. So again, I'm seeing lots of consistency there. So there are some things where we have a degree of certainty. There's obviously a couple of things that we don't, and I mentioned that in the government's negotiating mandate, they had published their suggestion and asked for a mutual recognition agreement, what we've called in the past the bare bones agreement between the EU and the UK to keep certain elements of recognition of processes in place there. And I don't think we do have clarity yet as to whether this has been accepted. I imagine this will continue to be part of the negotiation through the summer, potentially through the autumn, potentially close up to the deadline. We, of course, see this as vital to, and members have expressed to us the vital importance of having an MRA because it minimises delay in products reaching patients both in the UK and the EU. And there's already precedent for this between the EU and many other third countries. So we're glad that the government the UK government has asked for it, and we await the nature of the outcomes of the negotiations. And importantly, from our perspective, it's not just the UK companies that are asking for this, or UK associations. FPA, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries Association, and Europa Bio are also writing to the Commission on their side to encourage them to make sure that this is in place because it's disruptive to companies remaining within the EU as well as companies that have got importing, exporting from the UK. So I think everybody sees the benefit of this, but we don't yet have a deal for this. The next thing that's obviously a significant change compared to last year, and we still don't have answers to, is where will we be with COVID? The NHS is beginning to restart, but we've seen it being really disrupted in terms of its needs and requirements for medicines. We don't know whether it will be back to full usage and be running very, very hot on doing elective capacity work, or will it switch to doing COVID emergency work with the second wave? And I think that that's a level of complication for planning and assurance for those who've got medicines on the market. We've seen something of GPs writing some longer scripts for some things. Who knows? And I think that we know that there's a significant degree of uncertainty both around the MRA and obviously the position with COVID as we get into the second half of the year.
So should we have another poll on that point?
Do please.
So what's the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on post-transition supply chains? Time to get voting. So again, from the very negative to the very positive, the choice is yours. I see people are rushing to their buttons.
We've seen, well, I've heard talk from members from who are in a wide range of positions of this. You know that they're sitting on significant stock now because things that they would expect to have been used haven't been used, through to you know, significant disruptions in supply in the Far East, whether it be shut Indian factories are coming through the system and they're finding that difficult, or you know, in fact the products that they've been working on have been used up, or clinical trials have been cancelled. So I think we can see this. I get it. All ends up really in terms of anecdotal to me. So I'll be really interested to see if there's a consensus position, or where people are on this one.
Okay, let's give that a few more seconds and then we'll close the poll. And it's an overwhelmingly negative view, either slightly or significantly negative, coming in at the vast majority of responses there.
Thank you. This is really helpful for us to have real-time information as we go to meetings as to where people are, even impressionistically. So thank you for sharing. So I suppose the thing that that I'm hoping that we'll see is, in previous times we've had letters from the Department of Health to member companies that have got licensed medicines, explaining their expectation on the continuity of medicine supply ahead of a no deal or an end of transition period. And we saw one of these last June ahead of the planned no deal deadline last year. I'm pretty confident that we would see another one of these coming in line with the get ready message, in line with check, change and go. I think that it's a tricky challenge for the government, and we've talked about the NHS being in a different place this year as a result of COVID. So I'm hopeful that we will see this, and I suppose my request here is really stand ready. This may well come during the summer holiday period. Sometimes people have moved in organisations, it goes to an email address that's not the right email address, or that person's away, or we're all working in different ways now, and this will probably be an important communication. And I suppose, Nikki, we'll make sure that from a BIA perspective, when we see it, we'll jump up and down about it, and we'll put it on social media. And I'm sort of encouraging people as they see it to think about this, because it is likely that the department will be looking for a response in a similar way to they have in the past, and seeking reassurance. And if they're going to be slightly more intuitive in both their ask and their response, and I don't know exactly what the ask is going to be or what the responses are likely to be, getting into a dialogue or being able to provide reassurance or being able to say that you can't do it may be important. So I think that the to and fro and the response to this letter has been the mainstay of planning for the HSC and through them the NHS. And I'd encourage people, we've set up a good system over the last few years on this. If there's one thing that you do this summer, it's probably watch out for the letter and please be ready to respond if this makes sense for you. So we're now really into the countdown for January 2021, and I think we'll see those three levels of government preparedness going forward. We know for certain that we're not going to have an extension to the transition. We know that we're heading towards an end of year break that has significant challenges in terms of where that fits in the supply cycle. Obviously, Christmas and New Year is a particular point in many medicine supply cycle in terms of stocking up and being a busy point for things ahead of a winter period. We don't know where COVID is going to be, but the also thing that we know is that at present we're not going to be given any additional funding. Last year we were given funding for a Brexit readiness campaign through trade associations. There's been no talk of that this year. I have asked and I've not received any suggestions. So the capacity that we'll have to do some of that stuff for smaller companies, which we were able to do with regional players last year, there's no plans for that at the moment. And if that's a concern, please, it would be useful to hear your concerns if that was useful for you last year. So I suppose that all sets up the key question. Compared to last year, how confident are you that you have the capacity to deal with the coming issues as we lay them out? Do you feel, yep, got this one? Probably. Yeah, Nikki, do you want to read the categories out? Sorry,
so we've got your confidence is very confident, somewhat confident, ahead at the moment, not very confident, not confident at all. And can we start again, please? We'd like to give you the wildcard option. And we've got an encouraging, somewhat confident, nosing well ahead of the field here. Half of people have voted now. Give it a few more seconds.
Well, I think.
And let's close that one in 5 seconds. That's great, thank you. So that's a strong 56% of people are feeling somewhat confident on this.
Okay, so no, thank you. That's useful. I mean, I think many of us have been up and down the hill of getting ready for a no deal Brexit. We got quite close last year, didn't we? So I'm glad to see that most people are feeling that they have a good degree of confidence for this year. I suppose I'm keeping this very under close surveillance because I'm unsure as to the impact of how COVID hitting into it will work. But that's useful to know, and thank you. I'm glad that that's where you are, and if that's useful for you to see where your colleagues are across the industry. A little bit for me on Northern Ireland Protocol, and then I'm going to hand over to Emma. But obviously, what's the challenge for us in our sector? And maybe with the next slide, I can try and talk you through it. In some respects, the way that the Northern Ireland Protocol works means that that Northern Ireland remains through the withdrawal agreement and the Brexit agreement through the protocol, both an integral part of the EU market, but it also is an integral part of the UK market. So it is in both sides of this Venn diagram. And because it's part of the EU, the remit for our sector, the remit of the European Medicines Agency, obviously centralised approvals and other aspects continue to apply. So the regulations for medicines in Northern Ireland are those of the EU, continue to be EU rules. But there is a role for the MHRA. Sorry, I'm still on this one before we go forward. There is still a role for the MHRA because they have the job as the UK regulator of being responsible for the regulation in Northern Ireland, although they will have no say in how the rules are set or be at the table for the European Medicines Agency as to how to do this. So it's a complicated picture, both in terms of market and in terms of regulation. And if you add to this, you can see the border here delineated between Northern Ireland and the Republic, but what we're also not seeing is the potential border within the UK market between GB and Northern Ireland. So we have, in a sense, either two sets of borders or no sets of borders. There's an endeavour to make sure that there's no physical border on the island of Ireland, and the UK government is also insistent that there's no physical border between Wales, Scotland, England, and Northern Ireland. So I think the complexity is how do we operate with this, where this is something that has been agreed, it is something that is set out in the UK government's command paper, and the question is really how is this going to work? And I suppose next slide, one of the challenges that we've discovered is that actually having a separate or complicated different set of rules for a relatively small part of the UK by population, Northern Ireland is about the same size as the Leeds Bradford metropolitan area, is quite complex, but it's an important part of the market, and it's important that patients are continuing to be served. But so the size of that is quite important. But we have, of course, engaged with the government on this for many months. We've written blogs on this. We've written to ministers repeatedly about how is the Northern Ireland protocol going to work in practice for our sector. And I suppose there's sort of three buckets of issues. One is obviously falsified medicine was seen as one of the ways at some early point last year where you could enable a technical solution to these border problems, but I think that hasn't proven to be a way forward that's taken root, and actually how you run falsified medicines directive across the border between the UK, including Northern Ireland and the EU, is a thorny one, and I don't think is resolved. There's also a complex set of orders for importation and exportation. At what point do things enter the EU market? When do they leave the EU market? What happens when they come in? What's the rules? How do you go through that? I think there's what I call the border issues, and whether that border be the border within Northern Ireland, within the island of Ireland, or the border going into Northern Ireland. I think there's another big set of challenges there. But perhaps the third area of engagement, I hope the one that Emma can talk to, is really the fact that in Northern Ireland you have one location but two regulatory systems now. You have the MHRA responsible for running of the system, but it's clear that the EMA rules will apply. And Northern Ireland, in some senses, is both in the European market, the EMA, the EU market, but is also, under the way that the UK government is interpreting it, part of the common UK market, and therefore goods that are available in Northern Ireland should be available in the rest of the GB. And how that's going to work for a regulated good is one of the things that I think we've been grappling with and thinking about. So one of the things that we've asked is that these issues be put to the process that has been established under the protocol. It's called the Specialised Committee, and it meets, has EU and UK representatives, and we've asked that issues to do with our sector be looked at. This, I know that it's meeting this week. It held its first meeting on the 30th of March, and we understand it has been mentioned to the committee, and it's being looked at by a technical subgroup, which thank you to you, those of you who've raised it. We believe this is being taken in hand, but I don't think we've seen anything coming from this group yet, and we know that we're about 169 days away from turn of the year, so we know that this is pressing. And I hope that sort of underpins and sets up Emma Dufour, who I'm going to introduce now, who's done a fantastic job of helping me and others in the BIA have grapple with our understanding of what is a very complex issue. And as the chair of our Regulatory Affairs Advisory Group, has done sterling work bringing a really Mensa-style group of experts together to think about this. And Emma, over to you as to really how you've been approaching this and where your thinking has got to on this.
Thank you, Steve. And I think there's some nice themes you've presented I can pick up on here, and then it'd be great to have a discussion and answer questions the audience might have. I think we have got some sense of certainty for the end of the transition period for GB, and as Steve already highlighted, many of the regulations and guidance from MHRA will be in place for that. But the area and the thorny issue of how to apply the Northern Ireland Protocol, there is many questions remaining. And so it's great to see the BIA efforts to really drive through this conversation and get some answers for members. If we look at the command paper setting out the UK government's approach to applying the Northern Ireland Protocol, it clearly states that further guidance will be provided for traders around placing highly regulated products, which include medicines and devices, onto the market. However, this is still awaited, so we don't have the UK's interpretation of how medicines will be handled for placing on the market and moving in and out of Northern Ireland. And so in the absence of that, you only have a reference point, which is what the European Commission have published in this space. So they have published some guidance, and it was updated in March of this year, of how they interpret the Northern Ireland Protocol. And their interpretation is that movement of medicines from GB into Northern Ireland is classified as importation into the EU. So Northern Ireland is classified as essentially a member state for that purpose. And as soon as we have importation, then a set of regulatory requirements kicks in, which are fairly significant to handle. So that's important to be aware of. And it really does underline the importance of that mutual recognition agreement. If we can have a recognition between Europe and the UK in its entirety around this, many of these challenges will go away. So it really does underline the importance of that. However, for movement in the other direction, we really don't need an MRA. So allowing movement of product through the EU and through Northern Ireland into GB will already be acceptable. So you can see that we don't have an equal position, and it's very important, therefore, that the mutual recognition agreement is in place. And in the absence of any further guidance from the UK, we do have to move forward with the European view. And as I've mentioned already, that does state that under that implementation, any product or medicine or device placed on the market in Northern Ireland will need to be authorised under EU regulatory procedures. So it brings into focus the fact that regulatory governance and our supply chain decisions are inextricably linked here. Because once you understand the regulatory status of the medicine, you can then see the supply chain and potential importation implications of that. At the same time, the UK Medicines Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA, remain responsible for placing the products on the market and the monitoring of the products once they've been sold. So it creates this conflict between UK governance and monitoring of products on the market, yet those products must be approved through a European regulatory system. And so we'll have the centralised procedure, the mutual recognition procedure, including Northern Ireland as an effective member state in their regulatory decisions, and the MHRA being a passive recipient of those decisions. And at the same time, once the products are on the market, they remain responsible for them. So it does create some important questions, and as we go into the discussion phase, we can talk about some of those scenarios. It's also expected, however, that medicines and devices marketed in Northern Ireland will be recognised by MHRA as compliant for be placing on the market in Great Britain. So as you can see through this interpretation that comes from the Commission guidance, it will be much easier for product to flow into GB through Northern Ireland than in the reverse direction. So the implementation of the protocol is going to require some very specific considerations for supply chain, understanding how we can ensure that regulatory governance is in place and how the two interplay and support each other, and also in the support of research and development, because the same will apply for clinical trials, apply movement as we move forward. So that's just to set the scene. And I think then we'll be very interested in any questions you have about specific scenarios that could come up, and we'll be happy to talk to those.
Thanks, Emma. And can I urge people to pop their questions into the question box?
Yeah, perhaps whilst people are doing that, Nikki, I can take the opportunity to kick off really how my thinking has developed and ask Emma a couple of thoughts. So Emma, I mean, I think it's clear that we've been seeking advice on this for some time from government, and we've not been successful yet in receiving clarity around much of this. Some of this is your thinking, but some of this is set out in actual guidance. Talk me through a little bit as to you know how much more you think we should expect to get, and how much of it are we just going to have to you know, is there enough out there for us to be firm on this, or are we still speculating?
Thanks for the question, Steve. So I think the absence of any specific guidance issued by the UK government means that you defer to the Commission guidance. So obviously that's not ideal. We'd like a joint guidance that is agreed position from both parties so that everyone can be clear to move forward. But when only one party issues guidance, then you by default have to look to that. So I think, as you say, great work that's been done by BIA to raise this issue. And I think we are promised that guidance from the UK will come, hopefully in the coming weeks, hopefully not months. But I think I would encourage everyone at the moment to look at the scenario that the Commission guidance sets out for you, which is basically understanding that any product placed on the market in Northern Ireland will have to be covered by an EU regulatory procedure. So if you have products approved by the centralised procedure right now, you can look to those, including your Northern Ireland demand planning, and then you'll have a separate authorisation, which will be for GB. So that's really what the Commission guidance is driving us towards. is the separation of Northern Ireland being covered by the European regulatory system and procedures, and your GB product will be a separate license issued by the MHRA.
And Claire has a question on that, Emma, which is that EU licenses, CAPs, will be converted to a UK national licence. How can we sell these national licences in Northern Ireland?
This is a great question, and this is where I think we've seen a shift in recent times, and I welcome Steve's comments in a moment around this. I think at the beginning of the year, we were still very much waiting to see what that relationship between the UK and the EU would look like, hoping very much for a cooperative environment. But I think we have got to a point here now where we have to sort of take forward a scenario which is quite likely that we will have separation. So there will be that grandfathering in of existing centralised procedure authorisations to allow a GP national licence. But I intentionally use the term GB. We were originally thinking of it as a UK national licence that would cover Northern Ireland and GB. But in fact, what's shifted and changed is Northern Ireland will continue to be covered under your EU licence, and the grandfathered new licence issued by MHRA will be specifically covering Great Britain only.
And I think one that Steve might want to pick up comes from Colin Grant, who asks, does this increase the risk of falsified medicines entering the UK through Northern Ireland?
I think we don't know how falsified medicines is going to work yet, and I think anything that increases uncertainty and has borders which are open, but it makes it more difficult. This is one of those ones I work closely with colleagues in the ABPI on, and it is a toughie to see how this is going to work in practice on present guidance, and it's one that we keep raising. But
so to go back to Emma's previous answer, Claire has come back with a follow-up saying, so we'll need one pack for Northern Ireland with EU licence and one pack for the rest of the UK with a UK PL number. Is that right?
Yep, so we can address that, and then I can make a brief comment on falsified medicines if that's helpful as well. So the regard to the packs, there's sort of 3 stages to answer that question, I think, and this is where supply chain decisions and regulatory considerations start to merge and drive company decisions. So although medicines will separate out, and as I said, the regulation will be a European license that will cover Northern Ireland. There's many scenarios below that statement, but let's take that as a generalism, and there'll be a GB authorization. There is still the potential for a shared pack as long as your SMPC and your package insert text remains identical. There are challenges around how you will achieve that, but certainly the European Commission guidance does acknowledge the possibility to put that UK product license number in the blue blocks area on your pack that goes to Ireland. So as long as you're labeling identical, there is a theoretical potential. But I think then looking at demand and supply and volume considerations, will be a decision point as to whether it's possible. But there's a regulatory route to achieve that, but it's not the only consideration. There's many other supply chain elements that will decide whether a joint pack is viable. For MRP and DCP approved products, there is perhaps it's easier because you've got a national license in Ireland and a national license in the UK, and you can achieve a joint pack for that. But any divergence of your labelling over time would then mean you could no longer have a joint pack, and they would have to be separate. On the point of falsified medicines, again, it's scenario driven. As you look to these flows, if you've got product that is within the falsified medicines European medicines verification system for applying the serialization, you can actually see that a medicine can be taken into Northern Ireland and can actually be decommissioned, as it's at the point of pharmacy release as part of the European system. So their counterfeiting and issues can be quite easily handled. But if you have any goods that enter the UK and then you try and move them into Northern Ireland, then all the issues that Steve nicely set out kick in straight away because you've come out of the system and you're trying to go back into it. So falsified medicines is a really thorny issue. and you get supply chain, regulatory oversight, and falsified medicines all interplaying. And I think each company is going to have to look at its products and think about each one individually and what makes sense with all those three considerations taken on board.
And I think one of my learnings is that the border, if you like, going from Northern Ireland to the rest of GB is likely to be very different from the border going from GB into Northern Ireland. And understanding that West East and East West are different is one of the things that I've learned recently. I think the other thing that I've started to think about is not only what do we need to do to keep medicines going in January for patients, wherever they may be in the UK, in Northern Ireland, in the Republic, but I'm also starting to think about the implications of a scenario that's like this for future planning of future medicines. And many of the procedures, many of the companies in the BIA would have products that are advanced biologicals, which would normally go through a centralised process. And I don't know, Emma, where have you got to, or where have RAC got to in your discussions or thinking about the present state of the landscape and what that might mean for people who are thinking about drugs that could be go through regulatory procedures? What's been the discussion?
So I think certainly from the R&D stage and the clinical research stage, you know, that GB will continue to be very much an attractive offering. I think they'll be very agile and be supporting that process, you know, very nicely. When it comes to the official licensing stage for a medicine, I think it's very clear that the no deal planning guidance you referred to earlier, which will be in place as we end the transition period, will allow for a medicine to continue to be submitted through the centralised procedure. You'll have an authorisation granted, which will include Northern Ireland in its scope, and then that will have a mechanism at MHRA to be recognised and a GB licence issued off the back of that. So I think that process, you know, should flow very easily. But what it does is mean that you are relying on the European procedure. So to bring Northern Ireland into its scope and then to very rapidly have that UK licence as well.
So we've got quite a few questions coming in on regulatory issues, and one from Ian Schofield, who asked on the regulatory front, what's the situation where companies have new medicines ready to submit for marketing authorisation? Should they now be submitting to both the EU and UK, assuming the MHRA is able to assess drugs currently assessed by the EMA? And what happens where the CHMP issues a positive opinion before the end of 2020, but the MA will not be granted until next year? Will the MA be valid?
So we have some answers to that. So the first part was covered just now, but just to remind again, you know, moving forward, if you've got an application, you'll be able to go through the same centralised procedure, and the MHRA plans to have in place a process that when you get your positive CHMP opinion, they will also then look to issue a GB licence in the same time frame as the European Commission. So for that upcoming application, and that process will be in place. So you won't need to submit separately to MHRA. They are offering a targeted assessment approach, which will take the positive CHMP opinion and convert that into a UK authorisation. They do, however, still have a national licensing route available if that strategically works better for you. So both options will be available. And I think looking further ahead might be the subject of future webinars. You know, looking at what the UK can offer for that national route will be an important debate to be held, how it could be an attractive option moving forward. For any applications that are under assessment still at the end of the year, you'll hear the term in-flight used. The MHRA have committed to, again, allow those to go through to CHMP opinion, and you can use the targeted assessment route at the end and have the UK issue a GB licence, or if you would wish for a national licence, they'll pick it up at the point of assessment that the European system has reached. So both options will be available.
Thank you. And Colin Grant asks, what's the impact to QPs and batch release in Northern Ireland? Do they need to approve and report to both agencies? And is this an advantage to Northern Ireland? For example, if you're importing from the USA, will it make sense to import through Northern Ireland?
So that's a very important question because it depends what role they're playing. So if your QP is in Northern Ireland, they will not be able to release product for Europe. So Northern Ireland will be considered equivalent to a member state for the recipient of the outcome of regulatory procedures, but Northern Ireland can't be a location for any of the EU activities. So for batch release, for marketing authorization holder, for all of the activities that are happening there. So any QP release activity in Northern Ireland would only be applicable for the UK market. But it gets to this interplay between supply chain, regulatory that we've been debating here today, because as product moves, in and out of Northern Ireland, it isn't an equivalent move in both directions. So if you go from GB into Northern Ireland, that's an importation. And as things currently stand, there's the potential for that to therefore be the first point of entry into the EU. And then all of the normal testing and release would need to happen. But at that point, Northern Ireland can't do that for the whole of Europe. So it does really underlines the importance of the mutual recognition arrangements. Otherwise, you create a very complex situation. In reality, most medicinal products will need to move through other EU member states and flow into Northern Ireland to avoid that duplication of testing and release.
And on a related point, Raymond Spencer asks if goods manufactured in Northern Ireland will be classified as manufactured in the EU.
No, they won't. No, so they will still be classified as being manufactured in the United Kingdom. So Northern Ireland's status as equivalent to a member state is only for the purposes of regulatory decisions and for considering the activities of product moving into them as being equivalent to moving into the EU. But actual manufacturing, testing, release activities in Northern Ireland would not be recognised by the rest of the EU. This is the interpretation from the European Commission guidance. I'd just like to reinforce, because there is no equivalent UK government guidance issued. All of this response is based on the European Commission's interpretation of the Northern Ireland Protocol in the guidance they issued and was updated in March of this year. I think at this point in time, we don't have any basis to guide you in any different way. This is the guidance that's available in the absence of any other interpretation from the UK. It's a bit like preparing for a no-deal Brexit. If you prepare for this interpretation, you should be good. Then if there's any additional guidance, then obviously we would come back and report and share that. But at this point in time, I don't think we're seeing any indication that there will be any different interpretation before the end of the year.
So Steve, what Emma's said about the importance of the MRA, very much echoing what you were saying earlier, what's the way forward on this?
Well, we're going to keep banging on about it, I'm afraid. It's the absolutely crucial thing that's needed. We've been explicit all the way along, and I know we work closely with industry colleagues across Europe, and thank you to many members who've helped NEVIC on a stuck record on the importance of some of these issues. I'm afraid I can't 169 days out say yes, it's all done and dusted, and it is sitting within a process. It's not as if the people who are doing that negotiation aren't aware of these issues. They are fully aware of these issues, and we'll just keep going. Is the plain truth of it. I think the other elements of this that I'm taking away is I think that the disruptive nature of some of the tasks that could be there for some companies, where I know that there are tens of thousands of products that are stored in the GB market, which are imported forward into Northern Ireland only as a result of asks on this, whether there will be maintenance of those things on the market, whether the game is worth the candle, whether it's possible to do this, or how you might do this is one of the things that keeps me up at night, because if you have a far less availability of products, then that's very bad for patients. But if it's I can see that that's the way that the market could go in this scenario. I'm also deeply worried by, well, no, I'm not worried. I think that there's an interesting set of challenges, Emma, and maybe you have thoughts on this about whether for new products, gaining access onto the European market and then access through to the UK market through administrative procedure means the bar for the novel approaches that will need to be taken by the new MHRA is particularly high, and we need to match that ambition against a baseline of this as a route which many people know and understand, and companies that don't have large regulatory capacity, if you can go through the EMA, get your SME free tickets to much of the guidance through the EMA, the attractiveness of the MHRA needs to really be super duper, and at the moment, without any benefits for SMEs or other things, I'm not sure that it's quite at the level that will be needed to compete with what is emerging as the into Northern Ireland and then into the UK route through the way that we're looking at this from the guidance that's in front of us. I don't know, I'm speculating, but that's where my brain is at the moment. I don't know if you have thoughts.
Yeah, some really important points you raised there, and I think just looking for where we can find the positives in moving forward here. These are not new issues. Obviously you've raised them. I've raised them significantly over the last 18 to 24 months. I think we're seeing government really waking up, really some very fast movement now. And obviously we wish we had had this earlier, but we are where we are. So I think these issues are being tackled now. And we hope to see some movement and guidance in this space soon. But I think you're right. In reality, the sort of motorway from Northern Ireland across to GB is looking very attractive as an easy and quick way into the GB market, which just raises the bar significantly for what MHRA and the UK government will need to make as an offering for agility and access, and able to have the UK be that wonderful place, an attractive place to do your research, bring medicines to patients really quickly and efficiently, in order to offset the speed of the regulatory assessment process through Europe. So I think it's a sort of break the mold, rethink and redesign a whole approach, so that the most important breakthrough innovation in years to come people bring to the UK because of its attractive environment to research and get access to patients early. It really will be, it'll need to be transformational.
And I think, in a sense, that's the exciting opportunity, and I think we can share that. I know that there's some thinking along these lines certainly in UK government, but to make that happen in reality will take a detailed piece of work, and I think we need to work both with the regulators to set that ambition, to help them be able to deliver that in reality, and then make sure that there is support from the government to do that. So I think that's the positive way in which we'll look to engage with that discussion, which I expect to come very, very soon, and will underlie our sort of future thinking. And it's great to be able to work with you and experts and the RAC committee and with the broader BIA community in putting that positive agenda together. But I think, as with anything, when you're going into an international arena, you've got to make sure that you're competitive at the standard that there is. We sit here at the start of a test match today, and one of the important things is to know that you're competitive at that level for international competition. I just think we need to know the level of competition that's there. And this is a good way, and it's a good baseline against which we need to set the ambition that we can all work towards.
Absolutely. I think there's a balance between the future role for MHRA around public health. That doesn't change. In fact, it's emphasised with the recent Cumberledge report and others, around that importance of it being public facing, and really giving confidence to the medicines that are approved and available in GB and Northern Ireland, and at the same time really supporting that drive for innovation and that wonderful ecosystem of research we have in the UK.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions. That's been great, thank you. And we'll certainly take follow-ups if they come in, just to let you know what else is coming up and what to keep an eye out for. Oh, before that, we have a final poll. So your last chance to vote. And this one is on what impact a failure to resolve the questions over regulation and the Northern Ireland Protocol have on your supply chain. And the range is from a major negative impact through no particular impact to a major positive impact. You've got 5 choices, and the polls are open. So give us your feedback on where you're at.
Last chance to vote, I think, today, Nikki.
This is indeed our final poll of the day. For voting junkies, I'm afraid this is your last opportunity. And we've not got anyone yet choosing a positive impact. About half of you have voted so far. It's looking very evenly balanced between negative and not much impact yet. Give it another 5 seconds and then we'll close the poll. And there we have it. So the impact is, broadly speaking, negative. Nobody's gone for positive, and about a third of you thought it would be not particularly an issue.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
Thanks. So, Steve, do you want to just update on what we've been doing on Brexit and the transition? Because it's been a busy old period, even though people haven't heard too much from us on this. Yeah, so BIA with other trade associations is having fortnightly industry meetings with Lord Bethell and Nadeem Zahawi, where we're able to talk about the issues both of COVID, but we've blended that with some discussion as to the emerging challenges around the end of transition. There's a subset of the Life Science Council called the EU Relationship Group, or the ERG, which has continued to meet, and we hope to have another one of those soon. We've met with the various official level organisations around the specifics of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and we had a Life Science Council meeting which looked at where we were prepared and what else we needed to do for end of transition, as well as making sure that, as well as engaging with the government, parliamentary people interested engaged in this debate are also engaged. It's obviously been less of a focus of the discussion in Parliament this year than last year, given the nature of the majority, but it's important to make sure that the parliamentary discussion is also informed, and we've made sure that those like the All-Party Parliamentary Group and others who are interested are available, that know our concerns. I hope what we're doing through the BIA is keeping you up to date. The BIA Brexit portal is live, biabrexit.org. Much of the archive stuff, not archive, but the stuff from last year is there and remains extant and valid, and we're going to have a sweep over the next few weeks to make sure as we go through August into September that we've got the latest up to date there. And really, I suppose the way that I'm looking to use Newscast, which is our weekly email on a Monday, to keep you up to date with things if they move rapidly over the next couple of months. And we've done a report on stuff that we've done over the quarter, including some of the stuff on Brexit in our quarterly influencing report, which is excellent, and I encourage you to have a look. So Newscast and the quarterly influencing report, as well as the Brexit microsite, are where we're at. I suppose we should think a little bit as we going forward. Watch out for the letter. As I've said, the letter is expected, and engage with that over the summer if you get it. And we'll keep an eye on the negotiations, because they may move in unexpected ways, or they may not move in expected ways in the coming period. And we'll come back to you with things, with an update at an appropriate level, probably towards the end of the summer, but depending a bit on events. So that just remains to thank everyone for joining us, for putting in your questions, for voting in the polls. In particular, thank you to Emma, not just for answering your questions today, but also for the work she's doing on leading the Regulatory Affairs Advisory Committee and all their sterling work behind the scenes on this. We will be coming back to this issue quite soon and repeatedly, I think, over the next 6 months as we approach D-Day on the 1st of January 2021. But thank you all for joining us today, and goodbye.
Thank you.